What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are back to discuss Detroit Lions offseason once again today, as the offseason, really the moves are about to start being made. You know, we're getting close to free agency. The combine's at the beginning of March. We're going to start to see re-signings, extensions, like all of this stuff. It's about to go down, and we're here for it. You know, we'll be here with all the Lions news, but I thought we could do one more little, I guess you could call it kind of like a primer video, sort of. Specifically, this ties with the LA Rams, okay? Because the Rams just won a Super Bowl. Now, I'm sure before free agency officially, we'll do like a needs list and things like that, and we'll continue to talk about players that the Lions could target. But this video specifically is kind of about the Rams and Brad Holmes, who, of course, now is the Lions general manager. And I saw this article after the Rams won the Super Bowl that got me to thinking, and it really made me just dive into this. I'm not sure how I got to this point, but we did. So the Rams, the Lions, they make this big trade. Jared Goff, Stafford, first-round picks are involved. Michael Brockers is involved. The third-round comp pick is involved. All this is going on, and the Rams, they were kind of going, you could call it all in. They were going to make it happen, right? They go get Stafford. They make the Von Miller trade during the season. They also picked up Odell, which was not super expensive, but they did it. They went all in, and they kind of have been for the last couple of years, I guess you could say, to make this thing happen. And this year it paid off. They won the Super Bowl. They did it. Their end of the deal, what they wanted to accomplish, has been accomplished. Now it's Brad Holmes' turn to make it happen in the draft, because our side of the deal was more about the draft picks that we were getting in return to set up to build for the future. That's what we're going to dive into today. We're going to talk about the Detroit Lions offseason, what I've gathered from diving into since Brad Holmes has joined the LA Rams, the way that they've approached off seasons, the way that they've signed free agents, what kind of players they go for, the contracts they look for, the way they approach the draft last couple of days. And I think I have some good notes here. So let's get it started.
The city's been down, and it found a way to get up. And when you knock us down, we're going to get up. And on the way up, we're going to bite a kneecap off, all right? And we're going to stand up, and then it's going to take 2 more shots to knock us down. We're going to take another hunk out of you. Before long, we're going to be the last one standing.
Welcome everybody to our video. Glad you guys are here. And of course, we're back to talk about Lions offseason. I'm excited for this video because for the last couple of days, I've been diving into the Rams past, going back to really 2013 when Brad Holmes joined the LA Rams, and just taking a look at how they built what they built and how they just won a Super Bowl. Like, how did they get to that point? And we know that Brad Holmes was there from 2013 to 2020. And when the trade went down, the Stafford and Goff trade, we were both in different spots. It's like Brad Holmes said, Stafford asked for the trade. We were in different positions as an organization. The Lions were coming off of firing a head coach and general manager. Meanwhile, the Rams were coming off of winning a playoff game. We were in 2 different phases when that trade went down. And now it's Brad Holmes' move. You know, it's his turn. I don't play Pokemon, but I'm pretty sure that's how it goes. Like, it's your turn and then it's my turn. And it's his turn right now to make a move. Now, the Rams, they won the whole thing. So we get the worst pick in this year's draft in the first round, being at number 32. I mean, it's still the first round pick at the end of the day. Of course, maybe not the best value, but it's still a first round pick, and you got to make it happen because that's the trade that you agreed to, and you knew that was a possibility. I really wanted to just take a look at how the LA Rams got to where they were, specifically in the Sean McVay era is what stuck out to me, you know, because things really turned around in that Sean McVay era. They had Jeff Fisher. Les Snead was their general manager, and then they moved on from Jeff Fisher a few years into it. Things were not going very well. We know they drafted Jared Goff, and he played in 7 games. It was awful. I'll just put it like that. It was a terrible 7 games. So they moved on from Jeff Fisher. They kept Les Snead around. Jeff Fisher was kind of making all the moves. They bring in Sean McVay, and then all of a sudden, bam, we get this immediate turnaround. It feels like, you know, a team that went from 4-12, bottom of their division. The quarterback, their rookie quarterback at the time, was playing really bad. He was really struggling within an offense that was also struggling as a whole. We're talking about the worst offense in National Football League, scoring 14 points per game. And then they have this massive turnaround in 2017 with Sean McVay. In his first season as the Rams head coach, they are scoring the most points out of anybody in the National Football League. They get it turned around. They're 11-5, and they're in the playoffs. And then, as we know, in 2018, we're talking about a team that's in the Super Bowl. And I wanted to see how the Rams did it because Brad Holmes was a part of that, and he's been giving us these little nuggets of how he's going to go about the Lions offseason and building this team. And when you start to kind of put the pieces to the puzzle of how the Rams did things, it makes sense that he would follow a very similar pattern of what he knows. But of course, also being able to learn from some of the mistakes that they have made. But they've done a really good job since Sean McVay has come in. And of course, you got to give a lot of credit there to just Sean McVay on his own, just being a great offensive mind, helping out so much with an offense that was struggling big time. Players that he said, hey, go draft that guy. We know about about a few of them. We know he was a big advocate for making the trade up to go get Jared Goff. They ended up trading 6 picks away to go get to the number 1 spot and take Jared Goff. He was also apparently pounding his hand on the table to go get Aaron Donald, because as soon as he saw that guy sitting on the bench, he was like, man, that guy is ready to go. And this is a Tuesday practice, so they make that move. He was a part of a couple of those, is what we've been told. I think you could take a lot of that and apply it to probably how Brad Holmes is going to attack building this Lions team. And it should be pretty darn interesting. You know, you can build a team any way you want to. At the end of the day, it's just about results. And this will probably be a little bit different than I think what we've seen in past regimes for how they are going to go about building the team, you know, with the Lions. It's probably going to look a little bit different from what I have gathered. First step they have to point out is they brought in Sean McVay. The Lions have already done that. They've already brought in their coaching staff, but that was the first major move, was moving on from Jeff Fisher, bringing in Sean McVay, offensive mind, which took that offense to a completely another level. It's not like he didn't have pieces to work with, but they needed to address some spots. We're going to talk about that, but it was mainly Sean McVay coming in there, a great offensive mind, helping out Jared Goff a ton and helping out that offense a ton and putting that thing, you know, at the top of the list. Going from worst to best is an insane turnaround in one season offensively, and they did that. So you have to give Sean McVay a lot of credit. That was the first big thing that took place. And then also the staff that he brought in. Now, I'm not going to go into the entire staff, but mainly the big one, defensive coordinator, Wade Phillips. He's an older defensive coordinator, had a lot of experience, but everywhere he's been, he's pretty much been successful. And those words are coming from a guy like Bill Belichick. He's been successful everywhere he's been. So he was coming in as kind of that veteran defensive coordinator that's done it before. He understood it, and he took over that role as DC. Now, he wouldn't stay throughout the entire time, as it kind of seemed like Sean McVay was, you know, just wanted to go in a different direction. It did help them. They immediately, you know, improved defensively. They went from allowing like 24.9 points per game to 20.6 points per game, somewhere in that ballpark. So they improved immediately with him as their defensive coordinator. That's seemingly where it does start, is getting the staff in place. I mean, that's where it all happens. You have to have the right staff, and the Lions made that happen last year, and hopefully they're going to obtain Aubrey Pleasant, and they're going to keep Aaron Glenn around. It seems like that could be the case, so hopefully that is the case. For the Lions, we kind of tackled a little bit of that, naming Ben Johnson our offensive coordinator, figuring out who that was. When we went through the off-season plan and we talked about the Bengals, that was the first step, is figuring out who is our offensive coordinator, and the Lions have figured it out, naming Ben Johnson. I like the decision. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute when we talk about the Lions' offensive side of the ball, but that was kind of the first step. Defensively, we didn't bring in a vet defense coordinator, but we brought in Dom Capers to help that transition. However, I think we saw a lot of good out of Aaron Glenn, a lot of growth, and when you look at really both sides, Aaron Glenn's going to have to continue to grow. Now he's really taking over the job. He doesn't have that vet with him anymore. And Dom Capers, he's going on to Denver. And Dom Capers said we're heading the right direction defensively with that staff. But then you also look at the offensive side, and Ben Johnson's going to have to grow as well. It was not all perfect schematically, especially watching it back last night. Some of the play calls were kind of questionable. Some of the situations we put our guys in were kind of questionable. But it's also his first time being an offensive coordinator. So there needs to be that growth. But I do like that you're having that continuity with Jared Goff and the offensive coordinator, rather than trying to change it up again and trying to figure it out on the fly. Like, hold up, is this going to work? Is this pairing going to work together? Like, no, you saw success, you saw improvement. Now they'll work together throughout this offseason. The guys like him. He's very creative. So now you're going forward with that. So into that player acquisition phase. And this is his 2017 year, the first year for Sean McVay after, of course, all the coaching and getting your staff. And this is kind of where I feel like the Lions are right now, is, like Brad Holmes said, this player acquisition phase. It's where the Rams were in year one, because of where the Lions are financially. They have a little bit more money to spend, guys that they're going to re-sign, but then at the same time, they also have more draft capital to work with than they had last season. Last season was, as Brad Holmes put it, building the foundation, laying the foundation, and now it's kind of that player acquisition phase, and I think that's more where the Rams were in year one with Sean McVay. Taking a look at how the Rams did their free agencies and their draft, but specifically, let's talk about free agency over that time span, 2017, 18, 19, 20. Of course, Brad Holmes is not there in 21, but you could also probably throw that into the mix. Their free agency, they seem to kind of have some like unwritten guidelines or rules of kind of how to attack free agency. And we've hit on a couple of these, so let's kind of dive into them that I took away from looking at really all the years, but specifically these 4 years that Brad Holmes was there when Sean McVay came in. The first one being that they like to re-sign their guys. It's one of their biggest moves every single free agency, is re-signing their players, and we'll take a look at that when we dive into some of these names. But that's one of the biggest things that they do throughout free agency, is re-signing their guys to multi-year deals, and that goes hand in hand with building through the draft. Like, if you're going to say you're going to build through the draft. You want to, like Brad Holmes said when he immediately got here, we want to draft players and then re-sign our guys. And that's what the Rams have done. There's also the fact that they really haven't went out and made tons of big free agent signings for multiple years, like 3, 4, 5 years. They haven't done a ton of that. Is kind of plug holes, fill holes, plug holes throughout free agency. Now, a lot of the times they've done a fantastic job of being able to do this a little bit cheaper as well, not spending a ton of money. Like there was one point where they signed 6 free agents that helped their team for less than $9 million in an offseason. It's kind of plugging these holes with players that maybe they have connections, players that you feel like are reliable, not necessarily players that you're going to have around for a very long time, but on cheap deals. One thing that you notice is they don't really do a ton of huge backloading of contracts, giving these huge deals, which seems like it's going to be a little bit different than the way we've done things in the past. You think back to our last regime, not just Trey Flowers, but also deals like a Jesse James. That was a 3-year pretty big deal, and that wasn't a player that was their guy. That's not a player that they worked with. So that was like one of those deals. The Rams didn't seem to do a ton of that. Now, you could argue 2017 was in a way one of their most aggressive free agency periods, and the reason being is because they gave out 2 3-year deals to free agents that they didn't work with in the past. 2 guys that they went out and gave pretty big deals to in 2017 to kind of get things rolling. The 2016 season was not very good. And it wasn't just that Goff was a rookie. They had a lot of problems, specifically in the offensive side of the ball. So in 2017, that first free agency, with the money that they did have, 2 big moves that they made were first off signing Andrew Whitworth to a 3-year, $10+ million per season year deal, and then also bringing in Robert Woods, the receiver, to a 3-year deal. They haven't done a ton of this over this time span, but they did to start things off. They brought in 2 players like this, and these were 2 holes that they had to fill, but it kind of ties into what the Rams have done throughout free agency is plug holes. They plug holes, and they open themselves up in the draft so that they don't necessarily have to chase positions, because they don't want to have to chase positions. Now, of course, there's always certain positions that you want to attack more than others, and even after going free agency, sometimes you're just like, hey, we need more help here. And that was the case after this year 1 free agency. Like, they approached a receiver, they got one, they signed him on a pretty big deal. He didn't have a ton of production in the past, but he was young, so they brought him in for a 3-year deal, felt like he could be part of the future. Andrew Whitworth, he was 35 years old, but he was also the best one of the best tackles in football at the time, and they needed tackle help to protect Jared Goff because their protection was not good. So they made those 2 deals. But they haven't done a ton of this. And aside from those 2 deals, it was a lot of 1-year short-term deals, bringing guys in for short-term deals, sort of like the Lions did this past offseason, giving guys to plug holes at positions that they need to fill out, plug holes. Maybe they have connections, maybe they played with them before. You look at a guy like Kayvon Webster, he was mainly a special teamer at corner, or he was before, but they had connections with him, so when they brought him in, he was able to help them at cornerback, plugging holes kind of deals. And as you can see, it was a lot of these short-term deals that they were giving out in free agency, and this is kind of the route that they have followed, and it's something that we saw the Lions do last year. And the Lions did it sort of out of necessity, but they didn't come in and sign because they didn't have money, but they didn't go out and give these like super huge long-term deals. Most of their deals were 1 year, sometimes 2 years, like a Jamal Williams, but mainly like 1-year deals to just plug in some holes to open up what they could do in the draft. And that's what they did in the first year throughout free agency. So this was one of the only times they gave out these bigger multi-year deals, but it was at 2 holes that they had to fill. Try to open up what they could do in the draft. Now, in that 2017 draft, what the Rams did is something that I could see being similar to what the Lions could sort of do this season, is they went out and they got weapons. They knew they needed weapons. They needed receiver help. They needed offensive line, so they went and got Andrew Whitworth, but they needed weapons for this offense. This was the worst offense in the league. So not only did Sean McVay help them, but they needed to get some playmakers out there. They had the Todd Gurleys. They needed playmakers at the receiver/tight end position. So through the draft, Gerald Everett was their first pick. It was the 2nd-round pick. Then they came back and got Cooper Kupp. And then in the 4th round, they got Josh Reynolds. They went and got weapons. And then to tie into all of this, after all of this, they traded for receiver Sammy Watkins. Went and got playmakers on the outside. They knew they had to, so they went and did that. They like to open up these drafts so that they don't have to draft by need, but sometimes there's just certain positions that you need help at, and they needed help with weapons, and they went out and they approached that through trades, free agency, and also through the draft, drafting 3 weapons. Of course, they did pretty good with it, like Cooper Kupp. Yeah, he's been all right, and now Josh Reynolds was with the Detroit Lions. Take a look at the draft side in a second, But when you take a look at the Lions receiver position, I mean, yeah, I think they'll fill a couple of these holes through free agency just because they don't have a ton of guys under contract. Trinity Benson is under contract. Amon-Ra St. Brown is under contract. Quintez Cephas is under contract. But you have a pretty good amount of holes, and we know the Lions need improvement here anyway. I mean, when you have a guy like Josh Reynolds come in during the season as a guy that did not play, he was let go, and he comes in and becomes your top receiver, it tells you where you're at the receiver position. Unfortunately, the Lions had injuries, but they need improvement at both. They could use a top tier receiver to pair with St. Brown, but also depth at this position as well. Just better depth, kind of how the Rams went about approaching it throughout the draft in the offseason. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that's what the Lions will be doing. Now, I'm not saying Ben Johnson's the play caller McVay is because he's not. Reason for some optimism here, even though Ben Johnson does need to improve, is because, at that point in the season, he was doing a pretty good job with guys just like St. Brown and getting the best out of them and having them be successful week to week. Because what it really comes down to is the Lions are going to have to find ways to get the best out of these guys, and Ben Johnson seemingly was pointing us towards that direction. Took a look at this before the season started when he took a look at the guys that Jared Goff was throwing to. Wasn't a ton of like proven names. I mean, Sammy Watkins maybe a little bit more, but there wasn't a ton of like proven receivers that they had in 2017 or tight end. It was draft picks, it was young guys. Even Robert Woods wasn't extremely proven in terms of production. There's a lot of new additions, a lot of acquisitions to that spot, and then of course adding Andrew Whitworth. Now when you look at the Lions offense, when you look at where we kind of have, filled out the offensive line. We're pretty much good to go there, and that's usually the hardest spot for a lot of teams to fill out. Sometimes it could be their downfall is trying to figure out an offensive line. The Lions look like they're in a pretty darn good spot here with their offensive line, so you can kind of check that off the list as something that they don't have to worry about too much, aside from adding depth, which I'm sure they will throughout this draft. We'll talk about it. In terms of starters, they kind of have that checked off. What the Lions are going to probably go after is weapons, and we kind of had a tell to that when Antoine Randall Ellis said, hey, I want to draft 2 receivers and sign 1 free agent receiver. Now, he could have been talking about Josh Reynolds Khalif because Lions only have 2 receivers under contract, so it will be a position that they address. Maybe they do go grab a free agent at the receiver position this offseason. That's not someone they had last year. I think they'll probably bring back at least one of the receivers that they had this past season, whether that's Josh Reynolds or Khalif. I would like it to be Josh Reynolds, and then they'll probably draft multiple receivers because they should be looking at 10 draft picks, so they'll probably draft multiple receivers as well in this year's draft. So I could see some similarities there. Now, what helped them is they kind of lucked out that they had a pretty healthy offensive line. That's what the Lions, they don't, necessarily want to bank on having a healthy offensive line, especially with all this COVID stuff. This wasn't a thing back then, so you got to make sure you have depth. I'm sure the Lions will address that in this year's draft. Even Dan Campbell said it's a position that they're looking at, but you can't really, take anything. But I do believe that's a position to address is backup offensive tackle at least. From the Rams through this time with Sean McVay is that's kind of how they just continue to address free agency. And as you can see, in 2018, right, they brought in Ndamukong Suh on a 1-year deal. You bring in Wilson on a 1-year deal, easily re-signing. Sullivan, their center, they re-signed him. Nikhil Roby-Coleman was a re-signing who they brought in a year before to a 1-year deal. Sam Shields, they brought in a cheaper, vet cornerback with some upside on a 1-year deal. But that's kind of how they approached all of these free agencies is they didn't go out and sign like free agents that they didn't have before to huge deals, aside from really Andrew Whitworth and Robert Woods. They didn't really do that. They were giving out these big long-term deals. It was usually the players that they were just re-signing that were on their roster in years prior. Otherwise, they were a lot of times just plugging holes throughout free agency to open up their draft. That way they wouldn't have to necessarily go heavy on just drafting and trying to draft needs. You don't want to rely on a draft pick as a need, right? You don't want to rely upon that. Sometimes you have to. Like when they drafted Greg Robinson, number 2 overall. Like, hey, we need a tackle. We're going to have to take the guy number 2 overall. And you just got to do it the way that they wanted to approach it. And I think we saw Lions try to do that last season with limited resources, with filling out and plugging a lot of their holes with these 1-year deals to just see who's worthy of bringing back, things like that. Where do we need depth at? It was that setup. It was that building the foundation and also giving a lot of these young guys opportunities to play that way they could be ready to go in years down the road and figure out where they need help at going forward. The Lions in this upcoming free agency, they don't have a ton of money, so I don't anticipate a lot of this, but they could possibly do 1 or 2, signings to multi-year deals, kind of like the Rams did in 2017. Multi-year deals at positions they really feel like they need that aren't necessarily re-signings. But I think that's what we'll see a lot of going forward with Brad Holmes is a lot of re-signings, a lot of plugging holes, and then trying to open up what they could do throughout the draft. Essentially what the Rams do is they kind of sign stopgaps in free agency, not long-term deals, but stopgaps, guys that can come in and help them at those spots that they need, plug those holes, and they draft the players that they love in the draft, not necessarily relying on those guys that have to have an immediate impact. And then when they develop into any of those positions, then they take over that role. Ultimately, then they'll get their extension and the process repeats. And like 2017 for the Rams, the Lions re-signing Romeo Okwara was that big 3-year deal. Now they hadn't coached him, but he was coming back. He was coming off a good year, so they re-signed that guy. but they didn't have the money to bring back Kenny Golladay because of that. However, like the Rams, especially at certain positions of not overpaying guys, the Lions didn't do some wild stuff to try to bring back Kenny Golladay, understanding that they're going to get a comp pick in return, and we trust what we can do in the draft with those comp picks. So they wouldn't overpay for certain guys, especially for the Rams. When you have a defensive line like they did on the defense side of the ball, certain guys in the secondary can look much better than they maybe are, because of that defensive front that they have. So they didn't overpay for those guys, understanding we're going to get a comp pick in return that's pretty darn nice. You know, a guy like Aaron Donald, that wasn't necessarily a need for them, is to go get that. You know, they didn't need to go get a defensive tackle with that spot. It was a need listed, but I believe throughout that draft, CBS listed it as their 8th biggest need. It wasn't like, hey, we got to go get a DT, so let's go take Aaron Donald. It was just like, we can't pass up on this guy. Let's go take Aaron Donald. See, dude, 2019, you see Clay Matthews, he gets a 2-year deal. Dante Fowler, they bring him on a 1-year deal. Eric Weddle, they bring him on a 2-year deal. Blake Bortles, they get their backup quarterback in Blake Bortles on a 1-year deal. And of course, the rest is really re-signing players. 2020, Leonard Floyd, he replaces the outside linebacker position with Dante Fowler. Leonard Floyd, Michael Brockers re-signing. Andrew Whitworth re-sign him. Blythe re-sign him. Ashawn Robinson, he gets a 2-year deal. They're not trying to build through free agency, which would be a little bit different than what we've seen with some of these past regimes. When you think about the Trey Flowers, the Jesse James, the things like that, who'd rather have a vet in there that's like, all right, we kind of know what we're going to get, you know, for a year or two, nothing crazy. And, you know, we'll let the young guy take over eventually. For example, 2020. 2020 was a nice safety class, so they drafted 2 safeties. Maybe they didn't need to go do that, but they liked the safeties in that class, so they got 2 safeties in that draft, and it eventually helped them down the road, because when you had a guy like John Johnson come up for free agency, they had to let him go. They didn't have the money to pay it, so they let John Johnson go to the Cleveland Browns. He didn't have as great of a season as he did with the LA Rams, but they already had safeties that they could plug into that, right? They had guys. The Jordan Fuller is the 6th-round picks. Nick Scott, who was a round 7 pick already from the year before. So they already had guys that they could kind of just plug into that spot. Terrell Burgess was another guy. Rams didn't seem necessarily overpay even re-signings if the guy didn't live up to it. Like, if it was just like, hey, that's the only kind of guys we're going to sign. No, that's not the case. They weren't going to overpay guys. They didn't overpay some free agents, and what really seemed to be the spot that was the case was specifically secondary. There were 2 big name upcoming free agents like Rodney McLeod that they didn't end up bringing back in their secondary. They didn't pay back. Now, they did tag a guy back-to-back years, and that was Tremaine Johnson. They were unable to get an extension with him done, so they ended up just tagging him twice because they wanted to have that vet, you know, that guy that they knew what they were going to get out of the cornerback position. So they did do that. However, they didn't go out there and overpay for some of these guys. And unless Tracy Walker's contract gets ridiculous, I feel like Tracy Walker will be re-signed, because at the safety spot, you don't really have anything that you know what you're going to get, right? Will Harris went to corner, so you don't really have anybody at safety. So I feel like he'll be a re-signing to that spot, but he'll also be a guy that they saw play well and improve in the system. So it's like, hey, it's not going to be just a plug year. We like you. We're going to extend you. They just were unable to get the deal done with Tremaine Johnson. But then that moves you on to the draft. And I had a couple of notes that I took away from the draft on saying, really going back to 2013, on just some of the tendencies they have through the draft. So, of course, they like to draft best player available, who they feel that is. They never seem to come into a year without having a dominant defensive front. It was just as simple as that. Cornerback, safety, they could have young guys, UDFAs and things like that. Draft picks, linebackers, same thing. But they never really seemed to come into a year where it was like, man, that defensive line's bad. That never seemed to be the case. Aaron Donald was a huge reason for that, and it wasn't their biggest need, but they drafted him because Brad Holmes said we can't pass on him. Hopefully he can help us find that. It was a 3-4 defense with Wade Phillips. Everything seemed to kind of go off of having a dominant front. And the Lions got that started last year. Ali McNeil, Michael Brockers, Levi. And they'll probably add a little bit more depth to that. That always seemed to be the case. You know, maybe if they didn't go get a top guy, they would add some depth. A 7th-round pick here, a 4th-round pick here. They'd at least grab some depth. And I expect the Lions to at least grab some depth this season. They don't have to go high. They could if they feel like, hey, we can't pass on this dude. We're sitting at 32 and this is the best prospect. He's a D lineman. I think they'll take him. But at the same time, they'll probably bring in depth. They just never seem to come in with a bad D line. They had guys in and out. They drafted Alec Ogletree in 2013 as a 1st-round pick. 4 years later, he's not there. Mark Barron's the safety. They put the safety. Mark Barron's the safety. They moved to linebacker. You look at what they have right now at the linebacker unit. At one point, they had a short little stint with Corey Littleton. Look at what they have right now at the linebacker unit. Troy Reader is a UDFA, and Ernest Jones is a 3rd-round rookie. That's what they have at inside linebacker. So I'm not saying they want to address it. They feel like it's the best player. Like when they took Alec Ogletree, they'll take that guy, which actually was set up by another trade before Brad Holmes got there when they made it with RG3. We'll get into that. Had Michael Brockers before Brad Holmes joined the LA Rams, so he was already there. But as you could see, that was the position that they drafted the most defensively. It was the second most out of any position on the roster. It was 11 picks, and it makes sense. You can see why you throw value because it's tough to build up the trenches. I mean, everybody talks about it. I can't think of a guy that I watched and he's like, man, it's not about the trenches. Everybody talks about the importance of the trenches. So everybody's going to draft those positions. But that was the position they drafted most defensively. Outside linebacker, of course, you can see they didn't draft a ton there, but at the same time, they also landed some big names at that position. We had Dante Fowler, we had him, Clay Matthews. At one point, they signed it down and Kinsu. I mean, it was just a very dominant front, really from Aaron Donald on. It was a very scary front. Everything really seemed to go off of that. You knew that was going to be dominant, so everything else improved. The coverage, the linebackers, they all played better because of it, and you could have a little bit of question marks at other positions because you knew that that positional group was going to be scary as heck. Good secondary coaches. I mean, look at their cornerback unit. They had multiple guys that were UDFAs at one point, the Nickel Roby-Colemans, the Kayvon Websters, the safeties. They had some later round picks that were stepping in and playing big roles there. John Johnson was a third round pick. You look at the cornerback position for a second, right? Even in looking at what the Rams have right now, they have Jalen Ramsey. We'll get to the trades in a second. But aside from Jalen Ramsey, they have Darius Williams, UDFA back in 2018. They also have Dante Dion, UDFA. And they have David Long Jr. out of Michigan, who's a third round pick. What position did they usually draft heavier? You can see the trenches, O-line, and D-line. Offensive line had 14 draft picks from 2013 to 2020. So during that seven-year span, they had 14 draft picks. But it also tells you the average round. And as you can see on the defensive side of the ball, the highest average round pick was cornerback. Very close next to it would have been safety, and then outside linebacker. Defensive line is at 5.45, which is lower back with inside linebackers, which is the lowest out of any positional group, which is kind of what I was anticipating to get out of this, is that inside linebacker probably wasn't going to have many super high draft picks. They also only drafted 6 inside linebackers during that span. It was 5.5, but defensive line did have 11 picks. But on the offense side of the ball, as you can see, one thing that did surprise me was running back. I know Todd Gurley was in there. They drafted Todd Gurley before Sean McVay got there, but to see that, number one, they had 6 running backs taken. Okay, that one surprised me a little bit, sort of. But then also the fact that the average round was 3.33. Like, they had Trey Mason in there. He was a third round pick. Darrell Henderson, and then of course Cam Akers. That'll be a position to for sure watch out for. I know last year they went Jamar Jefferson, and knowing this, it'd be like, oh, that makes sense why they would draft a running back. Having Jefferson, Swift, Jamal's on his last year. I wouldn't count the Lions out for drafting him back at some point in this year's draft, especially a guy that could possibly maybe fill a little bit of that Godwin role, pass catcher. And then you also see tight ends on here. It's also pretty low, only 4 drafted tight ends, but they were sort of towards the middle at round 4. Don't really look at quarterback because it is what it is. They only took 2. But receiver, 8 draft picks. And on average, it was around 3.62. It's actually pretty high. One of those were Tavon Austin. They weren't really going very well, some of their receiver picks, up until the Josh Reynolds and the Cooper Kupps. And, up until that happened. Before that, it was kind of going rough with the Pharaoh Coopers, the Mike Thomases. The picks weren't resulting very well. But as you can see, it's a little bit higher in the draft. I guess if you compare it to how the Lions approached their draft, it kind of holds true, right? Defensive line, Lions went a little bit heavier there, got 2 defensive linemen. Of course, not in round 5, but they got 2 defensive linemen this past year. Derek Barnes, they drafted Barnes, but it was one of their last picks. They actually traded up to get him though, but it was their second to last pick where they got Derek Barnes to be a future inside linebacker for this team. St. Brown coming in round 4, maybe a little bit actually back. I think we'll go higher at receiver this coming up off season. Of course, you had to get a running back in there with Jamar Jefferson, and then Penei Sewell. It's the most drafted position that they had, and the Lions did it with their top pick. They would make some trades, okay? So this is kind of the next step, and we've been seeing a lot of this recently. But I think what the trades, because of the trades they're making, it can really cloud the vision of us, and it clouded my vision of how the Rams really built this sometimes. Because you kind of get caught up in, oh my gosh, they're trading for Von Miller, they're trading for Stafford, they're trading for, Marcus Peters and Jalen Ramsey and all this stuff. But what really can be overlooked because of that is that the Rams have killed the draft. How well they've killed the draft, specifically since Brad Holmes has joined them, because they're officially a shot through the roof with Brad Holmes working with them, is that because they've done so well on day 2, day 3, they've been able to trade picks. They've been able to trade, and they're also having cap open because they're not signing free agents that they don't necessarily know what he'll do on this team because he hasn't been here before to huge multi-year deals. They're not doing that. So they have cap open, and they have draft picks, because they love their draft picks, that they are willing to trade away, but because they also kill the draft. There's a couple statistics from this year's draft. First thing, the Rams have the most players drafted on their roster this season of any team. in the National Football League. That can be overlooked because you think about all the trades they make. This is where the approach gets interesting, because what they do is not necessarily that they don't take the modern day approach of building through the draft. They do build through the draft, but they also take a different approach, which became trades. Now, it's important to mention here that they didn't go out and immediately start making these huge trades that they've been making recently in 2017. They made a trade, the Sammy Watkins deal, but they weren't making massive trades in 2017. But they've never been afraid to move, and we saw it with Brad Holmes last year. Trinity Benson trade, not a huge one, but Trinity Benson trade. They moved the board to get Derek Barnes. Never been afraid to move the board. I mean, the Rams with Les Snead have never shied away from moving the board. They have traded like crazy. They traded their number 2 pick when RG3 was coming out to the Redskins, to Washington, which landed in Michael Brockers. Then they traded back again to the 14th pick. They did a double trade back from 6 to 14 in that draft to land in Michael Brockers. It also gave him a future first and things like that. I believe this is because the Rams look at it as, hey, there's a reason guys are free agents most of the time, right? A lot of times there's a reason they're free agents. Some of it is because the team can't simply afford to pay him. But the Rams stay away from those guys. They're not going to go give you a 5-year, $90 million deal if you haven't been on this team. Not in free agency. They would rather invest their draft picks, players that are currently on the team for a reason, whether that's the rookie deal, sometimes it's on their second contract, so they're getting paid. They'd rather give picks to go get those guys. Maybe they're disgruntled, they don't like their fit, whatever it may be. The team's not in playoff contention, so they're trading guys away. And they've done that time and time again. Brandon Cooks, Leonard Floyd, Jalen Ramsey, they give up 2 first-round picks. They have shown that they're more willing to do that than go sign a huge free agent in free agency. And they have the cap to do it, which some teams don't during the year, because they don't give out these huge multi-years that lock into multiple seasons to guys that are free agents that they don't have. They would rather go get a guy that's on a team, like a Jalen Ramsey, who was balling with Jacksonville, than go out and sign someone huge to a huge deal in free agency that's probably there for a reason, whether it's injuries, he costs way too darn much, older. So they'd rather go get a guy like Jalen Ramsey and say, hey, look, we'll give up 2 first-round picks. We'll give you these picks, because what teams do a lot is they almost overvalue the worth of picks. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Every situation is different. But think about what the Jacksonville Jaguars are getting out of that. Jacksonville Jaguars, in return for that trade, the 2 first-round picks in the 4th, have gotten Caleb, the edge rusher out of LSU, and Travis Etienne the running back out of Clemson, who didn't play this year. We'll see what he becomes. But it definitely seems like the Rams have won that trade, because now they've won the Super Bowl. Did the same thing with Von Miller. You know, they traded for Von Miller, give up a 2nd round and 3rd round pick in the future. Did the same thing for Stafford. Like, it's just because of the fact that those are the kind of players they want to get. I think that's a huge part of it. But I think there's also the side of it that's, hey, we trust what we could get because we're getting value out of these later picks. I drafted a 1st-round pick since Jared Goff. They haven't had a first-round picks in 2017, and they're not going to have one for years to come. We'll see how well they do without Brad Holmes, his efficiency. So they were able to rely on the fact that he was able to do things like that with whatever pick that you gave him, and they were very willing to move the board. Many times they traded back sometimes, and they traded back multiple times in a row to go get, I think one of their safety picks in the 2nd round was off of 2 trade backs out of the 1st round. They have moved around the board. They've traded up, they traded down. We saw Brad Holmes do it last year with Derek Barnes. He's not afraid of a trade, and that's why he said, hey, yeah, I'm open to trading the 2 pick. If I get a ridiculous offer, I might just do it, depending on how he feels with the guys available. So that's one thing that's huge, is that, yeah, they've made trades, but when this really started going crazy was 2018. When they started going Ramsey, Marcus Peters, Aqib Talib, when they started going nuts with trades, Brandon Cooks, was 2018. Why? Because they were coming off 11-5 season. They knew that they were a contender. Now it was just about getting over the top. More likely, I got 2 first-round picks that are going to turn to Jalen Ramsey, or going and getting Jalen Ramsey, who's young at the time of the trade, so he's going to be part of the future. What's more likely? It's probably more likely that just go get Jalen Ramsey and that he's going to be that guy in LA than me trying to turn those 2 first-round picks into that guy. So it opened it up once they built through the draft, and they continue to build through the draft and prove that they could go that direction. And then they just attack trades over attacking big, huge signings in free agency that weren't their guys. It's almost like avoiding an unnecessary risk in a way. I mean, you say it's risky to make these trades, and it kind of is, but you're almost avoiding sometimes an unnecessary risk of signing a guy like we did with a Jesse James or a Justin Coleman that you don't really know for sure if he's going to fit perfectly in this environment, in this culture, in this defense, or whatever, with that huge deal that you locked up, especially if you're putting a lot of guaranteed money there, rather than a guy that you've seen in this team. You know how he's going to respond to the culture. You know what he brings to the locker room. You sign your guys because you're getting those guys throughout the draft. It's almost like they're avoiding a risk factor here. It's an interesting way to do it, but it's proved to be very good, and it's worked. And hopefully we can have a season like they did in 2017 that can shoot us into saying, hey, we can make this thing happen. You got 10 draft picks to do it, right? This is what Brad Holmes is supposed to be great at. He was great with the Rams. He excelled them. He hit on some monster picks, whether it was having the impact over Aaron Donald or Jared Goff. Now it's his time to bring that side to Detroit and run this like they did. Of course, they also made the trades. They made the Brandon Cooks trade because it's 2018. You're like, hey, we just went 11-5. We're going 13-3 this year. We have a chance to go into the Super Bowl. They went to the Super Bowl. Let's go get Brandon Cooks. Let's go get him because we know what he is and he can help us right now. We didn't go sign a guy like Brandon Cooks in free to see whether that was because he had an injury, he was getting paid too much, or he's old. We're going to go get Cooks who could be part of our future. And yeah, I mean, look, not everybody fit. That's how it goes sometimes, right? Tavon Austin, they end up trading away Tavon Austin. They tried to fit it, but it didn't work. Tavon Austin was barely an impact player. They didn't get a huge return, but they traded him away. They've done that with a few guys on this team for later round picks, but they value those later round picks. I think the Lions will do some similar things there offensively. You know, with this kind of West Coast style that the Lions are kind of running, that the Miami Dolphins had when Dan Campbell was there, and so was our new offensive coordinator, Ben Johnson, that kind of West Coast style. Assume that to continue to be the case. They said we want to be able to run the ball, so they'll probably continue to invest upon that, you know, when it comes to free agency and the draft. Continue to invest upon that, add a little more depth to offensive line because you've really figured out the hardest part of the offensive line. Shout out to Bob Quinn who got us started, but you've really kind of solved it, almost it seems like, at least with the starters. You got a great offensive line. Not many teams can say that, and that's really one of the most important steps of any NFL team that's successful. Then it's about getting depth. The Lions continue to improve, but they already have some players. So bring back their guys. They'll bring back the Evan Browns. I can pretty much guarantee that because it's their guy. They know what he did. They'll bring him back, give him a tender. It's about getting weapons, and I'm assuming they're going to approach that pretty heavy, you know, kind of maybe like the Rams did. You know, they'll probably draft two guys like Randall L. said with having about 10 picks in this year's draft, depending on how they trade and stuff. I think it's a good plan. You just have to stick to that plan. I think it makes sense. You have to bank on something. Do you want to bank on your ability to grab a free agent and sign him to a huge deal, or do you want to bank on what your specialty is, which is drafting players? He's probably going to lean to what he believes he's best at, which is drafting. We know as a whole for next season, a lot of it's going to come down to development for some of these year two guys, development as a coaching staff with Ben Johnson, things like that, and how these guys perform with this coaching staff. Because one thing that is a benefit is that when you go 11-5, free agents may be much more interested the next offseason to take a cheap, you know, 1-year deal. Hey, I'm going here to win some football games. Versus when you're not doing so well, you know, it's tougher to probably get free agents to do that without having more security there. I'm assuming the defense line will continue to be addressed because it just always seemed to be great, and it was not great last year. I'm assuming they'll continue to address that, but other positions seem to just kind of be, all right, if he's best player, we'll take him. It's as simple as that. If he's the best player on our defensive board, we'll take him, whether that's corner, linebacker, or safety. We're not going to force the pick, but we'll take them, and we'll plug holes throughout free agency. And where the Lions need to plug holes throughout free agency seem to be safety. You know, Tracy Walker will plug part of that hole. Maybe it's someone else in there, another vet too. Maybe cornerback, but the Lions don't have a bad cornerback unit. I mean, we compare it to what the Rams had before all the trades. They have a pretty good cornerback unit. If he was a third-round pick, Okudah was a top pick, we'll see what he becomes. But Jacobs, Amani, these guys, Amani's on his last year, so maybe you draft another cornerback in there. He played well. Jacobs played well, should do a lot if he's going to be part of the future. A.J. Parker took Nickell Roby-Coleman's spot, who was their top slot. So you have a pretty bright future that you've already kind of laid the foundation to in the back end. And now it's just about plugging in some pieces. Linebacker, they never seem to really go crazy like approaching inside linebacker. But if it's there and they believe the talent's there like Alec Ogletree, they may take a shot on it. They're going to build that way. Old school style, build through the trenches, help this West Coast style of offense so you could take shots, be explosive. And yeah, I expect it to be very similar to what the Rams have done and how they've turned things around. It comes down to coaching at the end of it all and being able to draft for Brad Holmes. It's his time to make it happen, right? Rams did what they said they were going to do. They traded for Stafford for that reason. They made it happen. Now it's up to Brad Holmes because Stafford did ask out. There wasn't tons he could really do there. I mean, he could be like, no, you can't leave, but he wasn't going to do that. So plus he believes in Goff. So it's his time now to make worth of those picks that he got. I think Iffy was a great step in the right direction. That became their third comp pick. But now you got these 2 first-round picks to continue to build upon that. You can move the board. You can trade those picks for a player. Whatever you want to do, it's his time now to do that. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, man. I thought I could just kind of break into this a little bit, give some thoughts out there on how the Rams have done it and how the Lions could do the same. Thank you, Brett, for watching, and I'm out.